There is something drifting in the Atlantic Ocean right now that is roughly 9,000 kilometers long, and you can see it from orbit. It runs from West Africa to the Gulf of Mexico. It is not a landmass, not an oil slick, and not a glitch in the imaging. It is alive. It appeared out of nothing in 2011. It has returned every year since, and it has never been larger than it is now. By the end of this, you will know what it is, and why nobody can agree where it came from. Every month, a lab in Florida publishes a map of the Atlantic Ocean built from satellite imagery, and on that map there is a band of color running from the coast of West Africa all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. At its seasonal maximum, it measures roughly 8,850 kilometers end to end. That is about 5,500 miles. It crosses an entire ocean basin. It is not a reef, it is not a landmass, not an oil slick, not a debris field, and not an artifact of the imaging system. It is alive. What the satellites are resolving is a floating population of brown seaweed, and by total biomass, it is the largest bloom of its kind ever documented anywhere on this planet. Here is the part that should stop you. Before the year 2011, it was not there. Not smaller, not undetected, not there. The satellite record covers the entire transition, and it shows a clean before and after. Nothing through 2010, and then a continuous ocean-spanning structure that has reformed every single year since. Scientists call it the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt. The organism is Sargassum, a genus of brown seaweed, and two species dominate the belt, Sargassum natans and Sargassum fluitans. What makes these two unusual is that they never attach to the seafloor at any point in their lives. Most seaweed anchors to rock. These two are born, grow, break apart, and die entirely adrift at the surface, held up by small gas-filled bladders that look like clusters of miniature grapes. Buoyancy keeps them in the sunlit layer, which is the only place they can photosynthesize, and they reproduce mostly by falling apart. A piece snaps off, and the piece is a new individual, so a structure the width of an ocean appeared inside a single human lifetime, made of an organism that has been in the Atlantic for tens of millions of years. The obvious question is what changed? 15 years in, 3 separate research teams have published 3 different answers, and the newest one says the question itself was wrong. Before going further, one detail needs correcting, because almost every photograph you have seen attached to this story is misleading. The satellite product comes from the Optical Oceanography Lab at the University of South Florida through a system called the Sargasso Watch System. It works by detecting the specific way this seaweed reflects light, and it turns that detection into abundance maps with a color scale. Cool colors for sparse, hot colors for concentrated. On those maps, the top color band, the most intense red, represents roughly 0.4% of the ocean's surface being covered by seaweed inside that pixel. 0.4%, not 40%, not 4. The most concentrated part of the largest bloom on Earth is mats and clumps scattered across water that is overwhelmingly open. You could sail a ship straight through the densest part of this thing and spend most of your time looking at ordinary blue water. That does not make it small. It makes it diffuse. Spread a thin scattering across 5,500 miles of tropical ocean, and the total still comes out in the tens of millions of tons. And individual mats can be enormous. Some resolved from orbit measure about a kilometer across on their own. The reason this matters is that the photographs circulating online, the ones showing a solid brown carpet stretching to the horizon, are pictures of a beach. They are pictures of what happens at the end of the journey, not pictures of the belt. And the difference between those two things turns out to be the difference between a habitat and a public health emergency, which we will get to. The belt was formally described and named in 2019 in a paper published in the journal Science by Mengqiu Wang, Chuanmin Hu, and colleagues. That paper documented the 2018 event, a belt exceeding 8,850 kilometers in length, containing more than 20 million metric tons of biomass. At the time, that was the largest macroalgal bloom ever recorded. That number has been beaten repeatedly since. In May of 2025, the satellite estimate for total sargassum across the entire Atlantic, including the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico, came in at roughly 37.5 to 38 million metric tons. That is an all-time record for the satellite era, and it is close to double the 2018 figure that made headlines around the world. 2026 has been running hot as well. In March, projections put more than 9.3 million tons already moving toward Florida and the Caribbean. The bulletin issued at the end of May reported record-high abundance for that month in every tracked region except the western Atlantic, with 3 separate large masses visible inside the belt at once. Then came June. The Caribbean Sea posted a record high for the month, and the Gulf of Mexico reached 5 million metric tons, nearly double the record set there the year before. Severe beaching events were reported along the southeast coast of Florida. Across the full belt, June landed only about 10% below June of 2025, second in the entire satellite record. The forecast language in the May bulletin was blunt. 2026 is set to be another major sargassum year, and possibly a record year by summer. The July and August bulletins are what settle it, and they arrive on a monthly schedule, which means this is a story with a specific checkable number attached to it, rather than an open-ended worry. Now we get to the actual mystery, and it is not the size of the thing. It is that the scientific community has produced 3 incompatible explanations for what feeds it inside 5 years, and every one of them is peer-reviewed. Start with the first, because it is the one that shaped public understanding of this story for half a decade. In May of 2021, Brian LaPointe of Florida Atlantic University's Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute led a study published in Nature Communications. His team analyzed 488 tissue samples of the seaweed itself, collected across 2 separate eras, one batch from 1983 through 1989, and a second batch from 2010 through 2019. Samples came from the Florida Keys, the Gulf Stream off Miami, Charleston and Cape Fear, Belize, and open ocean stations across the Sargasso Sea. The chemistry had moved, and it had moved in one direction. Tissue nitrogen content had increased by 35% since the 1980s. Tissue phosphorus content had dropped by 44%, and the ratio between the two had risen by 111%, going from roughly 13 to 1 up to 28 to 1. The highest nitrogen readings and the highest nitrogen isotope values showed up in coastal waters influenced by runoff from land. The lowest carbon-to-nitrogen ratios showed up in winter and spring during peak river discharge. The interpretation was straightforward. The open tropical Atlantic is naturally nutrient poor. Oceanographers call it oligotrophic. And for millions of years, this seaweed was limited by how little nitrogen and phosphorus it could find. If land-based nitrogen has now reached the tropical Atlantic in quantity, that ceiling comes off. Proposed sources included synthetic fertilizer runoff, untreated sewage, industrial discharge, and nutrient release from deforestation, funneled to the ocean mainly by the Amazon and the Mississippi, with the Congo also implicated. Global fertilizer production has risen roughly tenfold over recent decades. That framing landed hard, and you have probably encountered it. Human nutrient loading turned a nursery habitat into the largest harmful algal bloom in the world. It is a clean story with a clear villain, and it may still be partly correct. But 4 years later, a second team published a paper arguing the villain was the wrong one entirely. In November of 2025, the journal Nature Geoscience published work by Jung, Dupré, Foreman, and colleagues associated with the Max Planck Institute for Chemistry, and it proposed a mechanism that runs almost entirely through the ocean rather than the land. The chain works like this. Strong wind-driven upwelling near the equator lifts phosphorus-loaded water from far below up to the surface. That water gets carried northward into the Caribbean and across the belt's territory. The phosphorus arrives in excess, meaning there is more of it than the available nitrogen can pair with. And that surplus phosphorus benefits cyanobacteria that live directly on the drifting seaweed, riding along on the mats themselves. Those cyanobacteria pull nitrogen gas straight out of the atmosphere and convert it into a form the host can use. Read that again, because it describes a self-supplying arrangement. The ocean delivers the phosphorus from below. The microbes riding on the seaweed manufacture the nitrogen out of thin air. Nothing in that chain requires a farm, a sewage outfall, or a river. The paper concluded that variation in equatorial upwelling of excess phosphorus accounts for the majority of sargassum variability since 2011. And it did not hedge about the competing explanation. It argued explicitly against attributing the blooms mainly to agricultural runoff and deforestation. So by the end of 2025, you had 2 recent credible peer-reviewed papers pointing at opposite hemispheres of the problem. One said the nutrients come from land. One said the nutrients come from the ocean floor and the atmosphere, and that the land hypothesis is wrong. Both used real data. Neither was retracted. And then the argument got stranger because a third team came along and suggested that both sides might be describing different points in time. The most recent word on this comes from Joe, Novi, Hay, and colleagues, published in Nature Communications in 2026 under a title that gives away the entire finding, Changing Drivers of the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt, From Physical Forcing to Ecological Control. Mark Hay of Georgia Tech is among the authors, and the work is also archived with the United Kingdom's National Oceanography Center. Their nonlinear model argues the belt has run on 2 different engines at 2 different points in its own life, and that the handover has already happened. Start with the trigger. According to this work, the bloom was set off by a prolonged negative phase of the North Atlantic Oscillation, a large-scale atmospheric pressure pattern that swung sharply negative across the 2009 to 2010 period. That produced anomalous wind patterns, and those winds pushed Sargassum out of its historical range in the Sargasso Sea, east and south, toward West Africa and the equatorial Atlantic. A basin-scale dispersal event, not a temperature threshold, not pollution. Wind. Then the early engine. For the first several years, growth was driven by winter mixed-layer deepening in response to stronger winds. When winter mixing reaches further down, it pulls nutrients up into the sunlit layer from below. Winds and mixing set the size of the bloom year by year. And then the handover. Over time, a second driver grew until it took over. The recycling of nutrients within the mixed layer itself, carried out by the community of organisms living on and around the seaweed. And by aging mats breaking down and releasing their own nutrient load back into the water, where new growth immediately takes it up. That internal recycling has increased year over year, and the model finds it is now the dominant control on how big the belt gets. Here's the observation that makes this hard to argue with. In 2023 and 2024, stratification of the upper ocean increased. Stronger stratification means a more rigid boundary between surface water and the water beneath it, which means less nutrient supply reaching the sunlit layer from below. Under the old engine, that should have starved the bloom. The bloom should have shrunk. It did not shrink. The internal recycling covered the shortfall. That is what it looks like when a system stops depending on the thing that created it. The belt is no longer being pushed around from outside. It is running on material it already has, cycling it between living mats and dying mats and the water in between. And the atmospheric anomaly that started the whole thing in 2009 is now, by this account, historically interesting and functionally irrelevant. The second conclusion in that 2026 paper is arguably bigger than the mechanism, and it points in an unexpected direction. If the belt is now governed by internal ecological control rather than by year-to-year atmospheric noise, then it should be predictable. Systems driven by weather are chaotic and hard to forecast. Systems driven by their own internal recycling are far more stable, and stable systems can be modeled. The authors argue that blooms may now be forecastable, and that opens a door from forecasting to interception, from interception to managed harvest, and from managed harvest to carbon removal and biofuel feedstock. It also carries an uncomfortable implication for anyone hoping this problem resolves itself. A system sustained by internal recycling does not need the original trigger to continue. You cannot switch it off by fixing the thing that started it. On decadal timescales, this looks permanent. The honest position, though, is that the field has not settled, and it would be dishonest to tell you otherwise. The United States Environmental Protection Agency's own summary of the science, updated in February of 2026, states that scientists agree the belt is sustained by nutrients from ocean currents and land-based sources both, and it lists 7 separate proposed nutrient inputs: river discharge from the Congo, the Amazon and the Mississippi, upwelling off the coast of Africa, vertical mixing, equatorial upwelling, atmospheric deposition from Saharan dust, the burning of plant biomass across central and southern Africa, and nutrient loads from urbanized coastal areas. The agency's stated dominant theory is that no single source fuels the belt at all. Different sources play local roles at different points as the biomass drifts west, picking up whatever is available wherever it happens to be. 3 continents and the ocean floor, feeding one organism across a journey that takes months. And all of that happens offshore, in water nobody lives on. Which brings us to the part people actually experience. The belt itself is not the problem. Out in open water, these mats are functioning habitat, and they support roughly 100 species of fish and 145 species of invertebrates. Several of those cannot survive anywhere else. The emblematic case is the Sargassum fish, a frogfish that has evolved fleshy skin appendages and mottled brown and yellow coloring that make it effectively invisible against the weed. It swims poorly in open water. It is bound to the mats. Juvenile sea turtles of several species spend their early years inside these rafts, and commercially important fish, including dolphinfish and jacks, use them for shelter and foraging. The problem starts when the belt makes landfall. Once this material strands on a beach, it begins to rot within 24 to 48 hours. Decomposition releases hydrogen sulfide and ammonia. Hydrogen sulfide is the compound behind the rotten egg smell, and at elevated concentrations, it is a genuine respiratory and neurological toxin, not merely an unpleasant odor. The clearest documented case came during the 2018 mass stranding in the French West Indies. Physicians across Martinique and Guadeloupe recorded more than 11,000 cases of acute sargassum-related toxicity over an 8-month period. More than 8,000 in Martinique, more than 3,300 in Guadeloupe. The reported symptoms included cardiac palpitations, shortness of breath, dizziness, vertigo, headache, and skin rashes. The clinical characterization was published in the journal Clinical Toxicology. The French government responded by pledging 10 million euros for removal equipment capable of clearing strandings inside 48 hours, hydrogen sulfide monitoring along affected shorelines, physician training, and deployment of toxicology specialists to the islands. The ecological damage runs in parallel. Thick surface mats block light, smothering seagrass beds and corals underneath. As the biomass decays, it consumes dissolved oxygen, and where strandings are large and persistent, nearshore oxygen can fall far enough to kill fish and bottom-dwelling invertebrates outright. Nesting sea turtles can be blocked from reaching the beach, and hatchlings can be trapped in the weed line trying to reach the water. And there is one more finding that quietly closes off the escape route. Work published in Nature Communications in 2023 documented that pelagic sargassum concentrates arsenic in its tissue. That single fact constrains nearly every proposed use of the material: biofuel, biogas, compost, bioplastics, construction, trace element recovery. Anything routing it into agriculture or livestock, feed runs straight into it. As of August of 2026, nothing is operating at scale, so hold the two halves together. In open water, this is a nursery supporting more than 200 species. On a beach, the identical material is a public health hazard and an ecosystem killer with a metal problem. The organism did not change at all, only its location did. To understand how strange the belt is, you have to know where the seaweed came from, because it had one address for a very long time. The Sargasso Sea is the only sea on Earth with no land boundaries anywhere. It is bounded entirely by moving water: the Gulf Stream to the west, the North Atlantic Current to the north, the Canary Current to the east, and the North Atlantic Equatorial Current to the south. Those four form the North Atlantic Subtropical Gyre, a slow clockwise rotation that concentrates anything buoyant toward its center. Whatever floats in tends to stay in. That is why the seaweed accumulated there and effectively nowhere else for an extraordinarily long time. Portuguese navigators crossing the mid-Atlantic in the 15th century ran into the mats and named the region after them, from the Portuguese word sargasso. Christopher Columbus's crews recorded the weed in 1492 and reportedly feared the ships would be caught in it and unable to sail home. That fear was unfounded. The mats are far too thin and too broken up to hold a hull, but it seeded 5 centuries of maritime mythology about that stretch of ocean, mythology that overlaps geographically with what later became known as the Bermuda Triangle. How long has this arrangement held? Fossil evidence of pelagic sargassum communities in broadly the same part of the Atlantic goes back roughly 30 million years. 30 million years in one gyre with an ecosystem built around it. Then, in 2011, the organism turned up 3,000 kilometers away in the equatorial Atlantic, in a region where it had no established population, and the return connection to its historical home is weak and intermittent. That is the detail that reframes everything. The belt is not the Sargasso Sea overflowing its banks. It is a separate, self-maintaining population that founded itself somewhere new. The seaweed did not spread. It relocated, and the thing it built at the new address is now larger than the thing it left behind. One of the open questions on this story was answered yesterday, and the answer is not the one the spring forecast pointed at. Back in May, the projection was that 2026 might finish as an all-time record year. It will not. Researchers at the University of South Florida now believe this year's peak has already passed, and Brian Barnes, the lead scientist on the Sargassum Watch System, said 2026 is expected to land second all-time for tonnage washing onto beaches daily. Totals in every region started falling in July, while the distribution patterns held stable, which Barnes called a good sign. The qualifier matters, though. The Gulf still sat at a record high for the month of July, and every other region came in second only to 2025, meaning the beaching events continued right through the month along southeast Florida, around the Caribbean, and across the Lesser Antilles. In recent summers, more than 70,000 tons a day have been reaching coastlines across the tropical North Atlantic. So this year is not the worst on record. It is the second worst, and it is not over. But buried in that same update is a finding that matters far more than the ranking, and it points straight back at the mechanism. Marine scientists have now determined that some of the record 2025 blooms survived locally inside the Caribbean and the Gulf, and lasted long enough to help produce this year's growth in those same waters. Those remnants behaved like seed stock, growing where they sat, breaking into new living pieces, and starting the next season locally. If that pattern holds, the region will not always have to wait for a new crop to make the crossing from the middle of the Atlantic. The season could start earlier, warning times could shrink, and one exceptionally bad year could directly help produce the next one. That is the self-recycling story again, at smaller scale and closer to shore. The next question is whether the predictability claim survives contact with reality. The 2026 modeling work argues the bloom is now under internal control and therefore forecastable. That is a testable assertion, and the test is the next full forecast season. If the model calls it correctly, this field has genuinely turned a corner, and the conversation shifts from cleanup to interception, catching the biomass offshore before it ever reaches a beach. And the last one is the question nobody can put a date on. Self-sustaining systems that run on internal recycling are stable right up until the recycling loop breaks. A pathogen, a grazer population that finds a new food source, or a circulation change that scatters the mats faster than they can regroup would each do it. Nobody has modeled a collapse scenario for this belt in detail, and that is not a reassurance. A 30 million ton biological structure disappearing quickly would be its own event, with its own consequences for every species that now depends on it. What we are left with is a structure the width of an ocean that appeared inside living memory, that was probably set in motion by a wind pattern rather than by anything anyone did on purpose, that 3 sets of researchers cannot agree on the cause of, and that appears to have quietly taken over its own upkeep. It is measured every month by satellites, argued about in journals, and every summer some fraction of it lands on a coastline where people live. We will be tracking the next bulletin, and we will let you know what the fall numbers look like.